My resume self was pretty good, but all the while the basement of shadows was growing. Whenever you shove something in a basement, it doesn't die there. It just grows. And that's really what happened. The truth is, I hadn't been faithful to a partner since I was 17 years old. I didn't know how to make agreements I could keep or keep agreements I could make. Over time, what had developed was someone who was hollow inside. And I'm driving home from a confrontation that I had had, and I recognized that I was going to have to tell my wife that I had had an affair with a coworker. That very well could spell the end of everything I had built. And how would I tell her? And then here's the voice that came in. Oh, I love this voice. You don't have to tell her. I recognized, I'm going to lay it on the line, not actually to save the relationship, but actually to save myself.
Well, hello there, and welcome to this episode of The Terri Cole Show. And today I am interviewing a very special guest. He's kind of a new friend. His name is Rainier Wylde, and he is an experienced teacher, writer, and speaker. And he's someone who I met because I really liked his Instagram feed and what he was saying. I was like, he has embraced life for all that it is. He's lived many lives in his life. He's managed a Fortune 500 company, built businesses that he's also elegantly, so to speak, blown them up and burned them down, starting over from scratch. He holds a master's degree in psychology and has spent countless hours working with men and women in navigating the human soul. And one of the things that he talks about quite a bit is managing our shadow selves. We talk about that in this interview. And he just is someone who I feel like, what I said to him before we got off the interview is that he's has a gentle, wise soul, but he's someone who, I don't know, I got a very comfortable, safe vibe being around him, which is interesting, even though it was virtual, but we could see each other. So I hope you guys really enjoy this episode with Rainier Wylde as much as I enjoyed interviewing him. He also tells us all about infidelity in his marriage and what they did about it. So I hope you enjoy. Well, hello there. I'm super psyched to welcome my new pal, Rainier Wylde, to the show. Welcome.
Thank you, Terry. I'm excited to be here with you.
Me too. I'm trying to think about it. I think we just started, it's so funny. So many people have on the show I literally meet on Instagram where I'm like, I'm really into what you're doing. Let's talk about what you're doing. Is that how we met?
Yeah, I remember that there was a post all about relating and all about relationships requiring relating. And I remember we had some correspondence around that.
Oh, yes. I actually posted one of your posts.
That's right.
That's actually how it started. Anyway, well, I'm really excited that you are here because there's so many things to basically cover, and so much of the stuff that you talk about kind of just about being human, but you also talk about this term that I really am interested in talking more about called mother hunger, and basically how this differs from father wounds. So can we talk a little bit about that? Because I actually am interested in and teach quite a bit about mother and father wounds, but I'm curious. Tell me your experience, please.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there's professional ways of talking about the mother hunger, but my own way of thinking about it is that I have noticed romantically that the most dangerous woman in the room also happens to be the woman I want to give me the most attention. And I've talked to a number of men about that across the years, and we've compared notes. And a lot of this stems from this interesting connection we have with our mother, who is the most safe, unsafe person we knew. It was as though her attention was the thing that we so desperately craved and sometimes would receive. But at the same time, there was an inherent or an implicit riskiness to it or danger that came with it. Would we be rejected? And of course, our mother often is the least available person in the world, isn't she? I can remember this moment in which I was probably 4 years old, crawling up into bed with my mother, who was probably sleeping in. My father was on one of his many trips. And I said, "Mom, I love you the most." And she looked at me and had this big Cheshire cat grin and said, "Never say that again." And think of the inherent dualism that's present there that my little 4 or 5-year-old self would have learned, that she not only relished this, but it was also abhorrent to her. And I think that contains it.
Right, but tell me more about the meaning, what you think the meaning was for her to say that. What was the impetus to say it? And what was, for you, of course, I can imagine confusing, but how do you feel like that peak experience in childhood impacted you?
Yeah, well, it's so interesting, right, that of the thousands, maybe even millions of moments that happened, I can zone in on that one. So it must have been very significant. I think that what it probably meant to her was that she didn't want her children playing favorites. She, like any parent, probably wanted to distribute the care. She was being very generous of heart. She didn't want to create a divide. That's very generous of her. On the other hand, oh, didn't it feel good? And I, being emotionally sensitive, zoomed in on not the words, but the behavior, right? And so I picked up on that incongruity.
That's exactly what I was thinking, is that there's this mixed message of I'm pleased with that information, but don't share that information. Don't tell that information. That information is wrong. And then you're like, which one is it? How do you feel like that type of a thing impacted you, like in your life as you were growing up and relating to women?
Yeah, and I think this gets into that mother hunger element. The person you so desperately want to attend to also happens to be the least available to you. Right? She was telling me, hey, I'm not available to you. For all the right reasons. I'm your mother, of course, and that desire to attend to her was still so strong. So what I learned was there was this incredible collision that would happen in me that would give me a profound payoff of loving the least available person in the room.
Wow. So that's, what I would call a repeating a relationship reality. Where it's like we have this paradigm, this downloaded blueprint of what's appropriate, but it's really what's familiar, right? Even if you didn't like it, right? It's what's familiar. I had an unavailable father growing up, and it's like I tried to beat the odds on that all different ways because I started therapy when I was 19, and first I dated mostly unavailable people. Makes sense. Then I was like, oh my God, I started having these realizations in therapy like, oh, look, I'm drawn to this because it's familiar, but it causes me pain. I don't have to do this. So then I started dating. I started doing a lot of traveling around the world, and I was meeting these warm and effusive foreign guys, right, who just were so verbal and vocal and physical, and it was amazing, and the passionate and all the things. And then I came back to my therapist, and I was like, I really feel like I'm like getting, this whole thing, like I'm attracting really different men than my father. And she was like, Terri, they all live on other continents. She's like, you just traded one unavailability for another. And even though it was definitely more desirable than the emotionally unavailable man, she, helped me see. She's like, listen, there's a part of that repetition that is so strong. The real available, emotionally intelligent person basically is still too threatening.
That's right.
To you. And I was like, wow, hot damn. I was kind of surprised by that. And yet the information was so helpful, where I was like, maybe I should think twice before I fall in love with another person on Mykonos. You know what I mean? Like, maybe I don't need to meet another guy in Paris. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Boy, this really reminds me, of a moment I also had with a therapist who she said, what does love feel like? And, as soon as I delved into my own body, the answer that bubbled up was so spontaneous, but so almost alarming. I said, love feels like fear. And it wasn't just that it felt like fear. That was the same emotion, that the wires were plugged in to the same socket. And again, this is being attracted to the most dangerous person. And so, I can look back and I go, oh, what form of unavailability didn't I love? Like if you were long distance, oh, I love you. If you were emotionally unavailable, relationally unavailable, all of it. I loved you more. The thing that I was most afraid of, it was like a cue to love more.
Right. Because again, it's the kid. Because part of when we're looking at why these repeating relationship realities, like why do we do them? The child within, of course, is we're just seeking a friggin' do-over. We're like, I really want a different outcome. I really want a different outcome. And it's funny, I waited to get married until I was in my mid-30s. And I feel like I had a lot of therapy, and I was really dead set on not being with someone who was not super therapized themselves. Like that was a prerequisite. I was like, I'm literally not dating anyone unless they've had 20 years of therapy. And my friends were all like, might as well become a lesbian now, because the likelihood of that happening with a straight guy is small, which they were wrong. But I did have to find somebody 10 years older than me to have that much therapy. But I really got to a point where I realized that if I can't, with my partner, honestly and open-heartedly deal with our past experiences, or if they're not aware of what they might be repeating or what might be being triggered in them, that it's such a heavy lift to be in a relationship with someone who does not know themselves in that way. Have you had that experience?
Absolutely. And, I'm sitting here, I'm thinking about something you said a few moments ago about how we seek out familiarity. And I used to conceptualize it like we seek the same situations, but I don't think that's exactly the case anymore. I think it's that we seek out situations that produce the same emotions we experienced. We're so cued into the emotional experience we had, and we replicate those. Although I love what you said, we're looking for a do-over. And I think that's the great hope. The great hope is that I would find this and that it would produce a different outcome. And isn't it amazing when it does?
It's amazing, but usually in my experience, and listen, I'm a therapist, right? So of course, that's the lens with which I see all of this, is that without some kind of intervention, without some kind of aha, without going into the basement, as I call it, right, your unconscious mind, and being like, okay, what is this shit really about? And let me unpack it. Let me honor it. Let me honor my childhood experiences. Let me consciously and actively tell myself and the universe that I want something actually different, that I'm open to something different. What ends up happening, and not all the time, right? Not all the time, but a lot of times we don't get a better result because we don't have the skills to create a different enough experience.
That really has been my experience. People often ask me, they say, well, where did you learn all this? And I can point them to the grad school I went to. I can point them to the careers I've had. But really, that's not where I learned any of this. I learned it from failure. I learned it because the pain threshold became so large in my life that eventually I had to say, this isn't working. I'm done. I've got to try something different here. I think that really is the moment when you recognize that you're ready to change. Great love and great suffering are really the two thresholds for transformation that I know. Those things, more than anything else, I think consistently will induct you into transformation.
Totally agree. Speaking of transformation, I know from your backstory that you basically walked away from what you built to reinvent yourself, to do something different. So would you share with us a little bit about that story and what motivated you to do that?
Sure. Well, I think that, I love that you said basement of unconscious. I often call it the basement of shadows. That correlates with building the skyscraper of our ego, the resume self on top of the surface. My resume self was pretty good. I had been a spiritual director. I had been a pastor. I had become a psychotherapist. I had become a professor at graduate school, a number of accolades, skills trainer, all these wonderful things. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. But all the while, the basement of shadows was growing. All the while, these undealt with places, the mother hunger, the lack of attending. And of course, that basement, whenever you shove something in a basement, it doesn't die there. It just grows and kind of grows mossy and moldy and gangly and long-haired and bearded. And there it kind of develops in these ways that when the basement door opens and that part of yourself comes out, oh my God, put it back. Get that thing back in. And that's really what happened. The truth is, I hadn't been faithful to a partner since I was 17 years old. I didn't know how to make agreements I could keep or keep agreements I could make. And the reality was, over time, what had developed was someone who was hollow inside. And so that skyscraper of ego was really built on a hollow ground. And of course, it came beautifully shattering down, and I'm driving home from a confrontation that I had, and I recognized that I was going to have to tell my wife that I had an affair with a coworker, and that very well could spell the end of everything I had built, and how would I tell her? And then here's the voice that came in. I love this voice. You don't have to tell her. You can tell a lie. Oh, isn't that great? And I recognized, I'm going to lay it on the line, not actually to save the relationship, but actually to save myself. And so I had this picture of these plates spinning in the air. One of the plates was my career. One of the plates was my romance. One of the plates was my social life, my friends, my family. And I recognized that all of them were going to fall to the ground. But I was willing to let them fall if I could simply say one true thing and build on that place. And that became the beginning of it all for me. And I look back on the beach where I told her, my partner, who is a marriage and family therapist, when I told her that I had been unfaithful. And I told her it wasn't just once, that actually there had been a number of infidelities in their own ways. And of course, she asks all the right questions, and she says all the things. And I know I'm going to lose the relationship. We go back to our cabin that night. I sleep on the couch. She sleeps on the bed. And in the middle of the night, I hear her say my name. She says, will you come in here? I say, yes. And she said, will you stand by the bed? And I say, yes. And then a few minutes go by, and she says, will you get in the bed? And I say, okay. She says, will you hold me? And I've often described that moment because I think that was the most transformational moment for me and for her at the same time. It was like we had never held each other. There had been a wall of secrets, wall of shadows between us. And there we were, I was, stripped bare. It's the moment of ultimate rejectability, where the things you are so certain will be rejected about you actually aren't. It's not that she embraced those things, but rather she embraced me. And from that place of deep authenticity, we began to rebuild. That right there. So when I say great love is transformative, I think that's what I mean.
What's so beautiful, thank you so much for sharing that story, because it's such a moving story. It's like, I find with my therapy clients that it's very hard. Like, you have some people who will put up with lots and lots and lots of stuff, and they're like, but if the person ever cheats, I'm out. It was like, my in-laws had a pretty unhappy marriage. They're both, rest in peace. But they were married for 65 years, survived being in prison camps, like all the things. And like my mother-in-law's greatest virtue, even though she couldn't stand my father-in-law, was that he never cheated. And I was like, wow, that bar is so effing low. But I also understood they were trauma survivors, and they had their own reasons. But in your telling of your story with Christy, right? Is that your wife's name?
Yes.
Yeah. There's something about, like, I'd be curious, what does she say her experience was of that pivotal moment for you? Did she know something was wrong? Did she feel that there was a wall of shadows between you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've really turned this soil over between us, and I think I can safely say that she points to another moment, and I was unaware of this, but I think it highlights her answer to it. She says there was this moment when I came home from work early, and we had this big front picture window, and she says that she was in the house with the kids We had 4 kids, diapers and all toys and a big fort in the middle of the front room. Chaos. And she says she looked out and she saw me driving home and she lit up. And then she looked back at the kids, and when she looked again, I had driven away. And for her, that's when she knew there was something amiss. And we both point to that, and we see that there was something in between us. Yeah, and she had become a specialist at home. She had specialized with the kids and with the doing and with those things. All of her attentions went that way, and all of my attentions were going another way. And so there was that glass wall already that was there. And of course, secrets and lies will create an even greater distance. It was felt, it wasn't known.
Right.
Yeah.
So you decided to stay together. She decided to stay. You
That's
decided to stay.
Right. That is
Obviously.
a beautiful part. Yeah. I mean, it was a tremendous calamity. I mean, it really was. It wiped us out. We had this very interesting moment that there was a blizzard that happened within a month of that moment. And that blizzard lasted for a solid month. We were snowed in. The roads weren't open. And we were at home with each other in total isolation and enclosure for a month. We look back on that as a real gift. We couldn't separate. We couldn't isolate. And we had to start talking to each other.
Wow.
That was a gift.
That is so intense. It's a lot like I hear from so many people online about sort of what their experience was in lockdown with the pandemic.
Yes.
And how I really saw there was this very clear distinction. You had the couples that the lockdown really fueled them, that they stopped being run by their calendar and they really wanted to be together, or they had hard conversations, even though they didn't want to, but they felt like there's something between us, we need to talk about it. Or you had the people where there were already cracks in the veneer, and their fast-paced life and their not spending time together made them be able to keep going. But I mean, a lot of clients went from seeing someone maybe 1 to 2 hours a day to seeing them 24/7.
Yeah.
And all the inequities became so apparent, like who's doing all the emotional labor, because a lot of my clients were also working full-time too, And so I think that it's interesting because your blizzard experience really could have gone either way.
Yeah, it really could have. That's such a great point. I think that, one of the things, we had always partnered well in times of crisis. That is one thing we've actually done fairly well. Both of us grew up in probably homes where we had to become good at times of crisis. And so it does, in fact, bring out the best in us as opposed to sometimes bringing out the worst. And so we were very committed to at least staying through the epicenter of the storm. And I think that, her in her own way, one of the things that she knew, she said to me later, she said, I knew that if I was going to do this, I actually had to confront my own demons, that this was not about your demons. This was about mine. And I couldn't have predicted that would have been her response. I was the grateful beneficiary of it. I tell you, what I did on my side was I threw myself into working with both professionals and peers who could understand and speak into my situation. I remember joining a men's group that emphasized authenticity over performance. That was its whole emphasis. It was filled with white-collar professionals, a lot of different people, but also people who were blue-collar, people who were homeless, and all of them were saying the same thing. I remember the first time I walked through that door, and each of these men was sharing, some times of real calamity in their life. They were saying, I'm so-and-so, and I've cheated 17 times, and I'm so-and-so, and I left my wife and 4 kids. And they all went around the room and told these really horrific stories. They came to me. It was my turn to introduce myself, and I say, well, I'm Rainier, and I'm actually just kind of doing a little bit of a journalism project here and just trying to figure out what you guys are all about. I wasn't ready yet even to say out loud my truth, but eventually that moment came. Whenever I talk to people today, if I'm mentoring people, one of the things I say is find those spaces where you can bring your whole self into the room. And that was really the first time I had ever actually allowed myself to come into a room safely. God, I had been a safe place for so many people. That's what that little boy knew how to do. He knew how to be a safe place for his mother. But I didn't know how to actually step into that same safety.
Amazing. Speaking of safety,
Yeah.
let's talk a little bit, because I know you do a lot of work around shadow and do a lot of shadow work with men and with women. And you say that men and women deal with their shadow in different ways. And I would love to hit that as our last topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find, and this probably isn't exactly, I wouldn't say this would stand the hard research, but just in my own anecdotal ways, I've noticed that men tend to be aware of their shadow. Like, they're burying it. And the illustration I kind of give is, just imagine an adolescent boy growing up, and he's looking at pornography, and he hides this porn magazine under his bed. His mom comes in and says, Joey, have you been looking at porn? And he says, no, absolutely not. And she says, okay. Well, later she comes back and she finds the magazine. She confronts him and says, well, we're taking you to the therapist. Now, in both ways, those are kind of a cutting away of his shadow. He's hiding it, and then he's trying to get rid of it. That's suppression. That's a suppression game. I'm stuffing it down. I'm very aware of it. I've got a problem. I tend to find that women, when it comes to their shadow, they've been able to be so successful at burying it that they've cut it away entirely out of their consciousness. What anger? What sexuality? I don't even have sex. They've repressed it. And so I think in terms of generalities, a very masculine approach to the shadow is to cut it away. And a very feminine approach to the shadow is to ignore it altogether.
Yeah, I think that I've seen in my my therapy practice, it's like such a disassociation from the experience that a lot of times you'll have projection where they're projecting the qualities they're disavowing in self onto someone else. And it's hard to know. And even something as simple as, because women are, traditionally have been raised to be nice above all things, be pleasant, to make sure everyone else is okay. So let's say I had a client who was working with someone new, and she didn't like the new person at work. But that didn't jive with her self-image, because she didn't have any good reason not to like her. She just didn't like her. So then she'd come in and talk to me and be like, that girl Patty I was telling you about, she doesn't like me. Like, and I don't know why, because everybody likes me. Like, I don't know why. And I'm like, it took a little peeling away of being like, does she actually not like you? Or do you not like her and you don't feel justified in those feelings? But it feels so real when you are, I don't know if that's projection or reaction formation, but where you're literally experiencing it as coming at you, even though it's actually coming from you. You want to be like, the call is coming from inside the house. You know what I mean?
What a great story. I love that, because it shows this kind of mind blindness, right? Yeah. And so we are literally kind of boomerang projecting that onto someone else. I often tell people the best window into what your shadow is, probably for those people who are repressing, is whatsoever pisseth thou off in someone else is a really good window to what you've got going on inside.
Yeah, totally. What do you think who do you gossip about? What do you find the most irritating in others? And then you're like, oh my goodness, look at that.
Yeah, it's so consistent. And it's a really great question. Almost any time you ask yourself that question, you're going to turn over something, no matter how much work you've done. I don't know. Even Thich Nhat Hanh probably was pissed off by people, even though peace is every step. He probably had to ask himself, what's really annoying me about so-and-so today?
Another monk is just irritating. He breathes too heavy when we're meditating.
I love it.
Okay, so tell me what you're lit up about right now in life.
I am in such an interesting season, and I'm going to be really candid here. It's not the answer to your question that you want. My father passed away unexpectedly less than a month ago. And he was 75 years old, and I don't think any of us saw it coming. And I've really been sitting with grief in this last month. I had said that great love is transformative. Well, I think grief or great suffering is the other invitation into transformation. And so I've really been sitting with how grief affects the individual, how grief affects those around that individual, the messages from society about grief. It's become so apparent to me that the message is overwhelming on day 1. We're so sorry for your loss. And on day 31, it's please move forward for all of our sake. And I think it's so interesting that we don't really have a space for that invitation. Just as I would say we don't really have a space for how love transforms us all that much due to our relentless seeking after it and searching for it, I would say that we don't really have a space for grief either. And so that's really been lighting me up these days.
It's such thank you so much for sharing it, and I am sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
But there is such in going through losses in my own life with my own father actually many years ago, I just could not believe how gobsmacked I was by the reverberations, the ripple effect of loss that I experienced. I didn't have a chance to make a better relationship with him because now he's gone. There were so many things. And one of my girlfriends, her name is Christina Rasmussen, she writes really beautifully and has created a whole community. And you can just go to the Facebook group if you want to, where so much space, and shares about her own. She had a young husband who passed when she had 2 little kids, and how not sufficient the grief counseling and how not helpful or satisfying it was. And she had the same message that you talk about, Rainier, where it was like, well, this is terrible, let me make you a casserole. And then it's like, okay, but now time to move on. And
I will insert right there that also casseroles do heal. I actually made a casserole the day after he passed, and everyone was quite happy about that. And I too gained some kind of transitional movement. But I do think that, the reality is grief is another word for love. Joy is something sacred. Delight is something sacred, but so is sorrow. So is grief. And we grieve those things that we love most fully. And so I think if you can use that as your window. My father and I did not, in fact, have a perfect relationship. It was very, very complicated. But something opened up in those last days. And in that space of mourning, there was something like forgiveness, something like healing that rushed in, that continues to be present there. So I think when we open ourselves up to those moments, there is something so beautiful, like love, that comes over us.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. All right, my last question for you personally: what has been your most challenging boundary struggle, and how have you overcome it, if you have?
Yeah, I like that you added that, if you have. And in fact, I want to comment on that. I had the opportunity to probably sit with one of my greatest mentors as far as an author goes. And I asked her, I said, what's the greatest lesson you learned? And she said, oh, I love that you put it past tense. I'm learning the same lesson over and over and over. I love that. And that has now been very true of my own life. I would say that my greatest struggle is actually even the idea of boundaries, that it's not a no, but rather that it's what am I exquisitely giving my yes to? That the boundaries of self that I'm setting are those things that I am saying consciously yes to and inviting. And that really has become the work for me. I became very obsessed in a younger stage of my development with saying no. That was so important. No was so important. But eventually that turned. And the lesson that I continue to learn is what gets my yes. What now gets my yes? And that's the most important boundary that I extend today. And by virtue of giving my yes to something, there's an implicit no hidden right in there, because that yes says no to a lot of things.
Yes, it does. Oh, I love that. All right, tell everyone where they can find you.
Please go over to Instagram, Rainier Wylde. That's where I hold court. And I also, these days, I'm having so much fun on my Substack, Into the Wild. That's WYLDE. And there I get to post more than 2,200 characters and record my voice on top of the writings I do and share things a little more intimately.
Well, thank you. All that info you guys know will be in the show notes. I really appreciate your time, your expertise, your gentle heart. Thank you, Rainier. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you, Terri.